Hi, this is O'Connor, and thank you for joining this module, and I think it's module 9, Beyond Rhetoric, Management Accounting, Environmental Management Accounting. And what we mean by Beyond Rhetoric is that we're not just talking about greenwashing or disclosing stuff. We're talking about getting information so we can make better decisions, so we can take better actions, do better innovations in order to decrease our sustainability or environmental footprint. Okay, so let's get into some of the challenges of traditional financial accounting and how management accounting allows us to look at the numbers from a different perspective and how we can actually classify the numbers differently, accounting numbers differently, so then we can inform and make better economic decisions for the benefit of the company's environmental footprint. So that's what we're about today. Let's get into it. All right, so I'm going to cover environmental management accounting defined, the problem with conventional accounting, some practical solutions, techniques for and benefits of environmental management accounting, environmental management accounting tools for investment appraisal and performance management, and two examples of environmental management accounting if we have time, and we may do that in a separate video. All right, so we tend to think of accountants as financial professionals, as only involved in the capture and use of financial data, basically transactions that the company has, around direct and indirect costs and revenues that flow from operations. Yet there's also a lot of environmental costs and impacts that need to be captured and utilized in decision making. So environmental management accounting has been defined as follows. And that is the management of environmental and economic performance via management accounting systems and practices that focus on both physical information on the flow of energy, water, materials, and waste, as well as monetary information on related costs, earnings, and savings. Big mouthful there, but we're really focusing on and are more sensitive to specific aspects of the environmental costs. Environmental data can be used to increase the efficiency of an organization, both from a financial and environmental perspective. So, one of the first steps required when implementing an environmental management accounting system is to define which environmental costs will be accounted for. So, we could actually organize or categorize environmental costs in terms of prevention, appraisal, internal failure, and external failure. Now, we've seen this categorization before when it comes to quality management, quality control in the factory, where we look at prevention of quality problems. We look at inspection of quality. Then we actually test products before they're sent to the customer, and if they fail, then we actually rework them or put them down as a reject so the customer doesn't get them and complain, which would be an external failure cost, and then the customer might sue you for a bad, faulty product. So the same type of classification can be given for environmental costs. Prevention costs associated with preventing adverse impacts on the environment. Appraisal costs associated with assessing compliance with policies related to environmental performance. Internal failure costs associated with eliminating environmental impacts caused by the organization, and external failure costs associated with environmental damage caused outside the organization. So the costs to be accounted for are often restricted to those currently recognized by an organization pursuant to conventional accounting practices. So prevention costs is, the actual hiring of someone that actually to go and inspect and monitor the operations of the organization with respect to its impact on the environment. Okay, hiring people to actually collect more data on the firm's pollution, their waste, and other items associated with its environmental impact. Appraisal costs can be associated with assessing compliance with policies related to environmental performance. So you're right, and a lot of the compliance with policies coming from the GHG and the other bodies that we mentioned in earlier modules. And so because we have to disclose scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3, now we need to go and assess and measure these initiatives that we are undertaking. So prevention and appraisal, prevention is about stopping things from getting worse. All right, prevention is about let's do good right from the start, whereas appraisal is more monitoring, observing and collecting data on what is actually happening. So then when we collect all that data, we can better report what we are doing. All right, so that's the difference between prevention and appraisal. But when we look at internal failure and external failure, internal failure could be, we might find that we're manufacturing a new item, but we find that there's dripping residue coming out of a particular process in the assembly, and we might see that if that residue is cleaned away and dripped off and goes into the waterway, then that's a major failure, a major pollution breach. But an internal failure cost is where we find it before it creates a catastrophic external failure, that is a pollution breach, and then someone comes along and then fines you for polluting the waterways. Okay, all right. So there's lots of examples out there that we can refer to. Yet these costs should be extended to include externalities such as pollution, just as I was talking about where possible. So there are two ideas I want you to take away first of all, and that's the problem with conventional accounting. Problem number one is poor measurement. And what do we mean by that? Well, typically accounting is going to be measuring monetary transactions, okay? The monetary transactions associated with corporate activities. When we buy and sell stuff, we transact, we get money, we sell the product, and so that becomes a monetary unit. It adds to the revenue, and then you got costs taken off that, then you got your profit, and then we report our profit and loss. We've got our balance sheet. Great. So that's the monetary, that's the MEMA. It's monetary environmental management accounting is when we put anything to do with what we're doing in the environment into monetary aspects, so we can report, we can disclose. That's great. But monetary does not mean control, and that's the big point I want to make here. If we're just measuring the monetary aspects of our environmental footprint, it does not necessarily allow us to make a better decision with regard to how can we reduce that environmental footprint. All right, the monetary is just a representation of transactions. It's a representation of the cost of some environmental initiative. All right, it doesn't help you make a better decision. What does help you make a better decision is if you focus on the physical environmental management accounting, and that refers to the company's impact on the natural environment. That is, we start measuring kilograms, cubic meters, or joules. So we start measuring kilograms of material per customer served, joules of energy. We start measuring kilowatt hours of electricity. We start measuring tons of water used each week, each month, each year. And let's see if we can reduce that amount of water in the following year. You see, once you start measuring the actual physical resources associated with the environment, then you're in a better position to think about how you can better control your environmental footprint or your environmental costs, because control, it starts with the physical resources, not with the monetary value. So the PEMA is assessing different solutions, that's what we got here, all right, and to reduce pollution and increase efficiency, whereas MEMA is to get management's attention, all right. So you've got to have both. You know, for the last 5 minutes I'm saying, well, you've got to focus on the physical, but you also need to focus on the monetary, because if you don't focus on the monetary, which converts the physical into monetary, then it's a bit hard to convince the board of directors, oh, we need to buy a new scraper to actually clean up our waste coming out of our factory so it doesn't run off into the waterway. Can we buy one next week? And the board of directors, first of all, they're going to think, okay, that's a great idea, but what are the costs and benefits? They want to know that if you're going to invest $200,000 in this machine, all right, what is the payback in 1 year, 2 year, 3 years time? You see, so they want to know the monetary aspect of some physical initiative, and so that's why MEMA is very important. MEMA is about getting management's attention so then they can give you the money to actually do the PEMA. The PEMA is where you get out and actually change actions, where you change ordering decisions, where you change the way you assemble items so you can reduce your environmental footprint. So MEMA and PEMA, both very important. The key difference, and this summarises it, is the type of measurement used and the information resulted, namely financial and non-financial measures and information respectively. All right, and summarising again, MEMA is about the impact about the environment on the firm's financial performance, and PEMA is about the direct effects on the environment. Now, you can't have one without the other. All right, you need MEMA to get money from senior management. You need PEMA because that's where the action happens. All right. So, number 2 problem of conventional accounting is poor classification. So, what do we mean by that? Okay, let's have a look. Conventional management accounting mostly neglects separate identification, classification, measurement and reporting of environmental information, especially environmental costs. Therefore, most corporates do not incorporate their environmental costs into decision making. Environmental costs constitute all costs regarding environmental damage and protection. So basically, if we want to understand poor classification, we need to understand what are the cost objects that we are attaching those costs to. Typically, we put environmental costs into a big basket and we call it overhead. We don't necessarily relate environmental costs with the actual manufacturing of a product, and so we put the costs of cleaning up around the factory so there's no runoff into the river or into the waterways. We put the cost of planting trees. We don't really associate that with the manufacture of a product that's going on inside the building, but we need to do this in order to get much more finite attention on the decisions we are making on the manufacturing operations. And so typically environmental costs are accumulated as overhead, but we need to think of more creative ways to better allocate environmental costs to the value creating activities in the organization. And the value creating activities are the making of products, the providing of services. And if we can attach environmental costs to these value creating activities, then that will, number one, make environmental costs more important, all right, because it informs the decision about whether we make product A, B, and C more accurately, all right. And number two, it just makes it more imperative that we don't just manage the product costs to be lower and lower and lower because customers are forcing us to sell it for lower and lower and lower, because environmental costs are now being attached to those products. Now it forces us to think of creative and innovative ways of how to better manage the environmental costs. All right. But in the past, environmental costs are in a separate bucket. They're just there. We have to disclose it. We have to do this, so we can't control it. But the minute we start attaching it to the product, then we have much more attention and a much more control over those environmental costs. And this is how we make an organization more sustainable over time, by actually focusing on all of the costs in the organization. And if we want to have a better focus, then we need to have a better classification. So that's why the second problem of conventional accounting is poor classification. Let's just have a look at this in a little bit more detail. So for example, environmental costs and expenditures have been classified according to the following environmental cost categories. There's waste disposal, emission treatment, costs to conventionally treat, dispose and clean up extant waste and emissions. There's prevention and environmental management, annual costs incurred for preventing waste and emissions. Environmental revenues, that's environmental revenues drawn from sales of waste or grants of subsidies. A key environmental cost for most organisations is waste. So we need to separate out what type of waste and classify that better, but also we need to attach that to our activities, our value creating activities. So this is an example of how we can actually separate out different elements of environmental costs. The use of energy, water and materials, generation of waste and emissions is directly related to many of the effects organisations have on the environment. So you've got to understand that the organisation doesn't just produce waste. The organisation makes products, provides services, and then in the process of these value creating activities, it creates waste. All right. So a byproduct of making the product is waste. So the actual creating products is also creating waste. And so this is how you see the connection. And this is why we need to better classify and reconnect waste with the operations and activities, the value creating activities of the organization. We could also include product design in there as well. What do we mean by that? Well, if we design a better product, that may reduce the extent of activities we undertake, and then that can actually reduce the waste that we produce. Wow, all connected. Everything is connected. So the problem with allocation of overhead, again, this is the poor allocation problem. Remember, in the past, we just had the poor classification, and that is really, rather than putting environmental costs into one overhead bucket, we actually separate out and we actually classify and call out different types of environmental costs. All right, the problem number 3 is poor allocation. The poor allocation of overheads to products to help. And when we don't allocate the environmental costs properly, then we don't make as good operation decisions and we don't make as good product design decisions. Where a variety of costs are accumulated in overhead accounts, the latter allocation of these accumulated costs to particular products or other cost centers are made according to simple metrics such as sales volume, output, or floor space. This might be an inaccurate way to allocate some environmental costs. For example, hazardous waste disposal costs might be allocated evenly across different product lines, even though most of these costs may stem from one product in particular. And so we need to have a more accurate allocation because it may be product C that is creating more waste than product A and B. So it doesn't make sense to just divide the waste cost by 3 and split it across 3 products. We want to directly allocate or work out the cause and effect of that waste and associate that with a particular product. Because in the end, we might decide strategically, let's drop product C because the environmental footprint of this organization is just too large. And let's just continue with product A and B. Or alternatively, it may get us to think, product C is actually creating a lot of waste. How about we invest some money and try and redesign that product so in the process of making it, we don't incur as much waste. Wow. Okay, all right. So what else can we learn? As a summary of just what I said, this would distort the product pricing and profitability analysis. All right, other problems. Problem 4, and that is poor systems thinking. What do we mean here? All right, poor systems thinking is poor understanding of the cause and effect, that A causes B, causes C, causes D. And systems thinking is around us altogether. Like if you get up 5 minutes earlier, it's likely you might get an earlier bus. It may be that's connected to a train that is earlier, and it may be you get to work 10 minutes earlier than if you get up 5 minutes later, and then it causes you to be half an hour later. That's interesting because that's a system. You're going from A to B to C to D. So in the organization, the system is all about the flow of resources in the organization. And when you can think of a system as a pull system, that is, a customer buys a product, so therefore we need to ship more inventory, so therefore it causes us to put in a production order, and then we need to order materials. So that's like a pull, cause and effect through the organization. But generally, the message of systems thinking is that everything is connected. You cannot say, we've got this environmental cost, but it's got nothing to do with our product manufacturing. It's got nothing to do with the sales service division of the organization. It's all connected. And so systems thinking is really not a DNA of typical accounting calculations. So let's have a look at what we can do here. Recognizing and dealing with externalities like pollution from a factory damaging the air. Obviously that pollution is going to be coming from the operations in the factory of making a product. So there's that system there. Recognizing that dealing with future environmental costs, lost customers, sales due to poor reputation in environmental management, again, that may not be an actual operations system, but in some ways it's part of the social system. The fact that you are neglecting your environmental footprint or your polluting the atmosphere may cause your employees to leave the organization because they're just not comfortable with your strategic vision and priorities for the environment. Or it may cause customers to not buy your product because they don't see that your ranking on the CDC ranking, like last week or week before modules, they don't see your ranking as very high compared to another brand, and they'll go and buy that brand instead. So, you know, there's a connected system there, and it's a social system. It's the system of norms and values and expectations of the community that work in your factory, of the community that buys your products and services. So systems thinking is both physical and also social. And if you think of those two aspects, everything in society is connected. And this is something that accounting does a very poor job at. So often we're trying to measure value of many costs related to the environment here. All right, so there's our 4 problems. And now we want to think in terms of the solutions. Well, the first solution is a broader scope of measurement. Measurement is key. How do we do that? As environmental costs may be hidden in accounting records, they cannot easily be found. They're assigned to overhead or not recognized at all. So we need to innovate, we need to investigate, we need to do more digging on actual transactions. So we need to set up cost categories for more obvious and discrete environmental management activities. There are less obvious costs to be more clearly labelled as environmental, so they can be traced more easily. So once you start classifying, then you're able to trace more easily. Consider what externalities the organisation creates, pollution, and look at ways to capture their true cost, e.g. the cost of cleanup of land spoiled by our organisation's use. So the solution one is a broader scope of measurement. I guess related to that is measurement over time. All right, so we want to think in terms of life cycle assessment, and here we are measuring the environmental impacts that may occur at each stage of the product cycle. You know, initial design, the ramp up, the production, and then the end of life cycle. And they're talking about, you know, the whole life cycle, the end of life cycle being the retiring of products and then the recycling of products. What about the costs of recycling products? What about the costs of recycling the lithium batteries that are in Tesla cars in 10 or 15 years time? What are we going to do with that? So life cycle assessment is looking at all the stages of the life cycle. So we need to examine the environmental impacts of product or activity across the entire life cycle, from raw materials until disposal, called life cycle analysis. So it's a systematic process of evaluating the life cycle costs of a product or service by identifying environmental consequences and assigning measures of monetary value to those consequences. The life cycle assessment includes identifying and quantifying energy and materials used and waste, released to the environmental impact, and evaluating opportunities to improve this. All right. So life cycle assessment will generate data on environmental relevance and their effects, which in turn enable entities to identify pollution reduction opportunities. All right. So I think the big takeaway is life cycle assessment is actually looking at all the parts of a product or a service. The initial design, the ramp up, the assembly, the inventory, the delivery, the sales, the returns, the disposal, right to the end. Okay, cradle to grave. Wow. All right. So solution 2, we could have a finer allocation of costs. So solution 1 was measurement. Solution 1 was a broader scope of measurement and measurement over time. Okay. Solution 2 is more associated with having a better allocation of costs. All right. So we want better measurement. Now we want better cost allocation. And activity-based costing is perfect for this. Why? Because it enables entities to allocate all costs, including environmental costs, to cost centers and cost drivers based on the activities. The main allocations to be considered including the volume of emissions or waste, toxicity of emission and waste treated, the volume of emissions treated, and relative costs for treating different kinds of emissions. ABC improves internal cost calculation by allocating costs typically found in overhead accounts to polluting activities and products that are determined by quantitative life cycle assessment procedures. Let me remind you, what are the cost drivers here? The cost drivers is the fact that you're making a product, that you are providing a service. All right, and the fact that you are undertaking these activities. You have decided to make products because we can sell it as a profit and make lots of money. But that activity of making a product is what is driving the environmental costs. So therefore, activity-based costing will help us to allocate the environmental costs to this product manufacturing activity. Wow. ABC also uncovers environmental related costs such as energy, water, waste disposal, commonly recognized as overheads. Hence, ABC will create more accurate cost information, not only for better product pricing, but also for reducing the entire cost and supporting pollution reduction activity products. Wow. All right. So number 2 solution is a finer allocation of costs. Remember, number 1 solution is better measurement. Okay. Better classification and better measurement over time. Number 2, the finer allocation of costs. So we're actually not just allocating costs to a big overhead, we're actually allocating costs based on a larger number of cost drivers. So it's not just machine hours that we allocate overhead to the product. Okay, we may not use machine hours, we may actually use other cost drivers to allocate to the product. So solution 2 is a finer allocation of costs. Solution 3 is about systematic mapping and alignment of environmental activities. This is where it gets back to systems thinking. Now remember, in some ways, activity-based costing is applying systems thinking because we're looking at a fine detail of when we got this machine running, what costs, environmental costs, is it driving, and then we allocate environmental costs to the product it is making. All right, and maybe not just based on the machine hours, but based on other aspects of the product that the machine has to do to make that product. All right, so that's the physical system and flow. When we talk about the systematic mapping and alignment of initiatives, we're also bringing in the social. We're bringing in the alignment of the employee motivations. All right, the alignment of the employee motivations so they feel at one with the company's vision for its environmental sustainability future. And also, it also is linked to the alignment with the community and customer vision for where that product needs to be in the future, whether it represents a sustainable future or not. So when we talk about systematic mapping, yes, we're going to be mapping some operational flows, but there are some other mapping that may not be connected in a physical sense, but it may be connected in a social sense. For example, if we ask all our employees to do training on environmental footprint of our company and how we can be better, pay attention to keeping things clean around the factory, then that can be linked to employee behavior of cleaning up after each setup of a product, or cleaning up when they see some rubbish around, they'll immediately put it in the bin. All right, and so that connection of training with that action is not a physical connection, that's a social connection. So when we talk about a systematic mapping and alignment, and we talk about a balanced scorecard, we are appealing not just to the physical connections of the operations in the organization, but also the social connections where we get employees engaged to do the right thing without having to tell them all the time, without having to monitor them all the time. So just this is a broader aspect of thinking about the system than activity-based costing. All right, so environmental perspectives can be incorporated into the balanced scorecard. It can act as an environmental balanced scorecard can act as a comprehensive performance management tool in an organization. It is a set of measurements that give top managers a comprehensive view of the business, including the effects of operational and environmental measures on different company perspectives, such as customer satisfaction, internal improvement, research and training, and financial and other perspectives related to business strategy. And environmental balanced scorecard integrates environmental specific indicators into each of the 4 aspects of the balanced scorecard. And finally, it guarantees that financial performance measures reflect environmental considerations by, for example, ensuring environmental costs are identified and allocated to budgets. All right, so you're probably wondering, what are we talking about with a balanced scorecard? We're talking about having a balance between the past and the future. Like accounting, financial accounting is very much in the past, and then in the future is kind of a strategy, the vision, right? So we've got to connect the two. And also we're connecting the financial and the non-financial. And in some ways, we're paying more attention to the non-financial because the financial very much is about transactions and it's in the past, and many of those transactions don't have a seemingly obvious connection with strategy. So we connect it with strategy through a set of financial measures and non-financial measures and operational measures in order to make visible the system that is working in the organization to create value, the system of value. What do we mean? Well, what we mean, if we look at the learning and growth perspective here, this is where traditional balanced scorecards have started. And that is, if we train the right people, then they will operate the factory machines more efficiently. And those operations will create products that will have less internal failure. They'll produce better quality products. And so therefore customers will be happy and they'll come back and buy more, and the company will make lots of money. All right, so that's a system, that's a story of the firm value. What we're doing with the environmental balance scorecard is to think in terms of how the environmental side feeds into the training of the people. How does the environmental footprint and the sustainability perspective impact on how we operate the internal processes, and how do we promote the firm's footprint and environmental initiatives to customers so we can make more sales. And often you've got the financial perspective that's going to fix up the transactions. So when we talk about the strategic relevance of environmental and social aspects, where they have relevance in all aspects of the system of value creation in the organization. Now, I've taught the balanced scorecard for many decades now, and the best idea that I would like you to take away with in thinking about the balanced scorecard without getting too confused is basically it's SMS. You all use your phone, you get SMS. I know you use WhatsApp, I know you use Facebook Messenger, but SMS is the way to go with the balanced scorecard. Why? Because it's all about the story of a company's strategy. It's all about the measurement of these different perspectives, not just operations, not just financial, but measuring customer satisfaction, measuring employee satisfaction, measuring employee training, measuring the environment. And it's about creating a linkage, a story between all these measures. So if we do well on the learning and growth, then that will feed into doing better on the internal process. Then that will feed into better sales and better customer satisfaction, and that will feed into more profits in the long term. So that's what we mean by the alignment of these different systems. So we've got strategy, we've got measurement, and we've got systems alignment. And that's what we mean by the balanced scorecard. And so an example for this case, I did say we're going to talk about case, but I think we just have time for this case on the balanced scorecard. And that is where this company not just has a typical balanced scorecard, and the typical one is financial performance, customer satisfaction, internal process, and learning and growth. That's the typical balanced scorecard. And as I said, the idea is that system story-wise, if we do well on training the people, we're going to have more efficient processes, then we can have better products coming out and delivered to customers on time. They're going to be satisfied, they're going to buy more, they're going to come back in the future, and then we're going to have better financial performance. Well, what we want to say is that if we focus on sustainable development, that can also add to these stories and system, because if we've got machines that are more sustainable, then it's likely that the internal business processes can be more cost efficient, and maybe we can expand more and then deliver faster to customers. If we have the sustainable development can be related to the learning and growth in inspiring employees to come up with initiatives to enhance the company's environmental footprint. In other words, reduce its pollution, reduce its environmental footprint, and make it more sustainable. And then in the process of allowing company employees come up with initiatives, get them involved in that, then they feel part of the organization. They feel part of the whole strategic vision of the company, which includes its sustainable development. So this is, when we talk about main criterion, we're talking about the stories of these different perspectives, and how one leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next. Now the example here is a bicycle industry that adapts to the sustainable management strategies. And once we have this general story in place, these objectives, we can start to think about how can we measure elements of each of these objectives, because it's these elements that we will see in operation. We may not necessarily see learning and growth, but we will see the restructuring, we will see employees' ability, we will see employee satisfaction, because we can measure all these things. We cannot measure internal business processes, but we can measure the information system readiness. We can measure the service provided. We can measure the extent that we are innovating on different processes. So we can, once we break down these items into subcomponents, then we can start to think of measures. And once we get measures in place, then, as the maxim goes, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So if we can measure it, then we can manage it and we can control it. And so this is what we mean by a balanced scorecard. And with the fifth element, where we're bringing in elements of sustainable development and measuring things like social care, protection of human rights, labour rights, industrial safety and health, we're measuring these things, then they start to become visible. They start to become an equal component of the company's strategy. Wow, that's wonderful. So there are the different things that we have taken you through, but here are the benefits of environmental management accounting. More informed decision making, that's what we want. We want better decision making, and that's not going to come from the profit and loss and balance sheet. We're going to uncover opportunities, because we might find that we can do recycling or use of waste in other activities, because now we're measuring it in more detail. We can break down different types of environmental costs into pollution, different types of waste, and different cleanup expenses. Improve pricing of products, because now through activity-based costing we have more informed cost allocation of products, so then we can better apply our general cost markup margins to those products. And if a product is not making a profit, then we could decide maybe we shouldn't manufacture a product C, because now when we allocate the environmental cost to that product, it is no longer profitable. It can assist with internal and external reporting, identifying environmental costs to help organisations to collect data about their environmental impact for internal and external reporting. And also it increases competitive advantage. Associated publicity might provide an organisation with a competitive advantage, knowing that, number one, employees really want to work for that organisation because they see on the inside that the company's vision does translate into better employment training opportunities, better operations and safety and sustainable operations, and better environmental outcomes. All right, and competitive advantage that flows outward into the brand reputation the CDC ranking, and then customers view that brand as being associated with the sustainability, and then customers might prefer that brand to other brands even though the price is the same, or even more expensive. Customers still will buy because they see it is associated with sustainability actions by the company. Improved reputation. Efforts to reduce environmental costs and related impact will have reputation implications over time, like I said, with respect to how customers perceive the brand and the products made by your brand and services provided by your brand. Finally, and I did harp on this several times, staff retention and attraction. This is an employee value proposition that is largely neglected by a lot of senior management. Managing for the environmental may enable a company to retain and attract better staff, as well as improve staff morale and engagement. So therefore, you don't have to pay efficiency wages. People want to work for this company because they want to be associated with what that company stands for. And if another company comes along, competitor, and offers 20% pay rise, you may say no, because I want to work for a company that I believe in and my values are aligned with its values with respect to sustainability and the environment. So we won't have time for the other case examples. I've given you a case example of the balanced scorecard, but in closing, what we did in this session was show you that traditional accounting fails in terms of measurement. It fails in non-financial measurement. It fails in cost allocation. It fails in actually classification of costs. It fails in many ways. And so a solution to the traditional accounting failures is to have better measurement, to have better cost classification, to have better cost allocation, and also to have better systems, measurement and connection. And that's what we mean by an environmental balanced scorecard. And this is what environmental management accounting can bring to the table that traditional financial accounting does not. This is O'Connor for Module 9, Beyond Rhetoric, Environmental Management Accounting. Stay tuned for future modules that are related to management accounting in the factory. See you for now and catch you in the classroom. Bye for now.